I'd like to bring up our first speaker, Nicole Bialco. Nicole grew up in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, and she currently teaches history at Linear Tech in Georgia. The title of her talk today is The Shawnee and the Long Knives, Lord Dunmore's War and the Fort Gower Resolves. So, welcome, Nicole.
How do I go to the next slide? All right, good morning. I will be introducing the history of Lord Dunmore's War and the Fort Gower Resolve so that you understand the context of everything we're discussing today. I apologize, I either have a teacher's voice or I have a very soft voice, so I'm going to try to make myself heard. To tell you very briefly about myself and who I am to even be discussing this, I earned my master's in history in 2022, and this was the topic of my master's thesis. I currently teach history courses, like Jessica said, at Linear Tech in Georgia. I'm also a multidisciplinary researcher, so I am simultaneously studying graduate level sociology through the University of Alabama at Birmingham, because I feel like that can bring another perspective to my history studies. Dunmore's War is a very, let's put that up there. I do have a YouTube channel that I put videos about this topic on when I have time, but Dunmore's War is a very personal topic for me because I do come from the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, and my interest began with wanting to understand the history of that area. So Roanoke, Virginia, what used to be part of Botetourt County, was the home of Andrew Lewis, who I'll be discussing today. So I come to this discussion from a slightly different perspective than everyone here in Ohio, but still appreciating those historical events nonetheless. My slides are just going to be maps. I have a zoomed in version. When I get to that, I hope you can see it okay. I'm just trying to give you a little bit of context when I refer to a location. And like I said, I will zoom in a moment, so hopefully everyone can actually see that. But historian Warren Hofstra wrote that the events we know as Lord Dunmore's War, quote, were soon overshadowed by the American Revolution and largely lost to the larger narrative of American history, end quote. And while this is true of most histories that have been written over the last 250 years, they overlook some key information by dismissing it. Rather than being overshadowed by the revolution, in some ways I would say it enabled the revolution. It proved the colonists' mettle in a time that many doubted we could stand up against the might of the British Army. It influenced politics within the Shawnee, something that would matter later when the British sought allies among the American Indians, and it was yet another event in the American Indian struggle against colonization. The thing is that Dunmore's War cannot be understood as a standalone event because it wasn't. It was influenced by earlier events like the French and Indian War and Pontiac's War. Men involved in Dunmore's War, many of them had fought in those earlier conflicts, and they would go on to fight in the American Revolution. While I do not personally consider Dunmore's War to be the beginning of the American Revolution, there were men at that time who did believe that. And so we have to understand that those perceptions did exist. John Murray, the Earl of Dunmore, was appointed governor of Virginia in 1771 after a brief stint as governor of New York. He quickly became associated with George Washington and many men like him who were interested in making a fortune through land sales. Dunmore ended up touring the Fort Pitt area, which we now know as Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and he saw the opportunity for Virginia to claim this area after General Gage had withdrawn British troops some time before, and Pennsylvania had failed to exert influence over this area. In fact, Virginia and Pennsylvania had conflicting charters. They both had some level of claim. Dunmore formed a business relationship with a man named Dr. John Connolly, a man who Dunmore then put in charge of Fort Pitt and to whom Dunmore promised a land grant near present-day Louisville, Kentucky. So you can understand, Connolly had an interest in making sure the colonists moved westward. From Dunmore's perspective, it didn't matter that the king had prohibited settlement west of the proclamation line, something I'll explain in a moment. And from Connolly's perspective, it was clear that his future success was tied to the success of whatever Dunmore chose to do, whatever purpose Dunmore might have. Prior to the defeat of the French in the French and Indian War, the powers that be in government had encouraged westward expansion of the colonists because it prevented the French from moving into areas that Britain wanted to maintain control of. And if we're talking about the poor Irish and Scots and Germans, far better that they get into conflict with the American Indians than the Englishmen back east. It provided a protective barrier. That had been the established policy for decades, and that's what these frontier colonists were accustomed to. In 1744, as part of the Treaty of Lancaster, the Six Nations ceded, quote, all the land in the said colony of Virginia, end quote. It's a very vague boundary, and not every tribe wanted the Six Nations to speak for them, although the Six Nations tended to do that regardless. But the Virginians saw it as confirmation of their rights, just like they saw the later 1752 Treaty of Logstown. At the end of the French and Indian War, the Crown's motivations had changed. They wanted to placate the tribes for the sake of peace, at least at the moment. The war had been very expensive. They couldn't afford to keep going indefinitely, so they wanted to have good relations with those tribes until they decided to violate the terms of treaties yet again. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 set a boundary line, also known as the Proclamation Line, beyond which the Anglo-American colonists were not supposed to settle. This line was determined by watersheds. So if you are traveling through the frontier, you're probably not exactly aware which side of the Appalachian Mountains you're on. So what they did was if the waters, the creeks and the rivers flowed eastward towards the ocean, then you were good, you were allowed to settle there. If those waters flowed westward towards the Mississippi, then that land was reserved for the American Indian tribes, and the settlers were not supposed to go in that area. It didn't actually mean that there would be no westward expansion. It just meant that there wouldn't be any right now, and that when it did occur, it would be at the Crown's direction. In theory, the colonists who lived beyond that line at the time of the proclamation were supposed to move back eastward. But the British government decided to make some exceptions for those settlements that were already well established and it would be impractical to move. So sometimes you hear of the Western Waters in Southeast Virginia. That is likely one of those settlements. And so if you look at a map around the time of this war, you will see that some of these men lived to the west of that line, and that is not because they were flouting the proclamation. It was because it didn't interfere with the motivations of the government to allow them to remain. There were also promises in this proclamation of land grants for French and Indian War veterans. These were the grants that men like Washington were relying on for years as they waited for the British government to come through. But later, the Crown would say, no, that didn't apply to you. That only applied to enlisted British regulars, not the militia that had fought. And so that upset some of the aspirations of these Virginians as they had waited for the westward lands to be opened up. There had been some moves towards westward expansion a few years before Dunmore's War through the treaties of Fort Stanwix, Hard Labor, and the subsequent Compromise of Lockburn, because the men that were in charge of Fort Stanwix and Hard Labor clearly didn't compare notes, so they had to go back and fix that. But it just wasn't at the pace the colonists wanted, at least those in power. If you were poor in the Blue Ridge, you settled wherever you felt like. Deeds didn't really matter so much. But if you were part of the Eastern elite and you're trying to make that fortune off the land speculation, you needed to have a deed in your name. Dunmore himself might be fairly considered a Virginian, or a long knife, as they were called, because American Indians began to use the term Virginian for any land-hungry white people. It didn't specifically mean residents of that colony. It meant an idea. Dunmore seemed to believe that he could request massive land grants from the government and that it would be approved, so he could give this land to himself and to all his friends as suited his purposes. He thought he could do this despite the proclamation line. After all, the colonists had interpreted this proclamation not to be a no, just a not right now. But he was quickly disabused of that notion. Lord Hillsborough outright rejected his request, and at that point, all Dunmore could do as governor of Virginia was to respect the current boundaries and wait for the crown to open those lands. Unless, of course, an Indian war broke out. And then he was free to do what he wanted. Different writers have explained the outbreak of hostilities in different ways. Some point to this skirmish or that skirmish as, oh, this was what sparked everything. But the truth is that hostilities along the frontier were common. The American Indians rightly resented the encroachment of the colonists, and the colonists believed they could do what they wanted. But usually, the Crown's Indian agent and others, like the governor of Pennsylvania, for example, could smooth things over by covering the graves of those who had been killed. This is a term that refers to giving gifts to make up for that loss of life. Not that it brought them back, but it soothed that hurt. But this time, however, instead of doing that, Dunmore's man, Dr. Connolly, seemed to have a very strange way of supporting peace. The local militia, a militia under his command in the Fort Pitt area, they did things like aiming their rifles across the river at peaceful American Indians living nearby, like the Mingo, which is a historical term for the group connected to the Six Nations who we now call Seneca Cayuga. Or attacking the friendly Lenni Lenape, also called Delaware, who happened to travel in the area. These were people that had not threatened them, but they abused their power at Connolly's direction. And then, to add insult to injury, Connolly chose to send out a circular letter announcing to all the backcountry colonists that the Shawnee were on the warpath. Unfortunately, I have not found a copy of this letter. If it still exists, I am left to the accounts of others who received it. But on what basis did he make this claim? There doesn't seem to have been any. But the people receiving that letter throughout the frontier didn't know that. What they knew was that this man who was in charge of Fort Pitt, because the governor had put him in charge, told them that this was the case. And they did not know that he had been promised land in Kentucky. They were told that there was a war, and so they acted accordingly, including perpetuating atrocities that one would certainly hope they would not have done in a time of peace. On April 30th, 1774, some Mingo crossed the Ohio River and went to the home of Joshua Baker. He sold alcohol to the group, which was also in violation of the royal proclamation, and some of them drank. Now, there are slightly different versions of events that I've read, but what it boils down to is that once some of them were drunk, a group of colonists led by Daniel Greathouse deliberately killed them all. 12 were murdered, and there was only one spared, a little baby whose mother was among the slain and whose father was a white man, an Indian trader she'd been married to by the name of John Gibson. This is known as the Yellow Creek Massacre. Captain John Logan, also called Chief Logan by the colonists, was among the Mingo living across the river. His father had been a Frenchman who was adopted by the Oneida, and his mother was a Cayuga. He had a track record of being friendly, even downright generous, with the white colonists. I once read a story of where he had been in a small town and overheard a woman lamenting the fact she could not afford to buy shoes for her daughter, and so he made the little girl moccasins. This was despite the fact that he had lost family members previously due to colonist violence. And now this time, the dead at the Yellow Creek Massacre included at least his brother and his sister, by some accounts his mother. This little baby who was spared was his niece. He gathered some men to form a war party and began raiding along the frontier in retaliation. Though this was not part of some conspiracy of the Shawnee, he was not Shawnee. From a distance, to colonists who didn't know better, it lended credibility to Connolly's claims. In June, Pennsylvanians passed along news to their governor that the Shawnee chiefs had been strong enough to prevent their people from going to war with the whites. Despite the skilled leadership present among the Shawnee, Connolly ordered his men to, quote, fall on every Indian they meet without respecting friend or foe, end quote. Given the evidence, it is hard to believe that Connolly's actions were not intentional. And the question then would be, was Dunmore aware of the fact? The news received in Virginia did not reflect the same information possessed by the Pennsylvanians or Alexander McKee, the Crown's Indian agent. What the Virginians were told instead was the contents of Connolly's circular, that the Shawnee had gone to war. Brothers Andrew Lewis and Charles Lewis were in Williamsburg at the time, serving in the House of Burgesses. They were Irishmen who had immigrated to America as children, and now they served for their respective counties, Botetourt and Augusta, in what's now Southeast Virginia. But they were there in Williamsburg when the circular arrived, and they met with Governor Dunmore about this news, who instructed them to contact their counties and order them to prepare, first for defense of their area, and second, to go on an expedition to counter the Shawnee. The brothers were veterans of the French and Indian War, and Dunmore decided that Andrew would lead a southern division of men from Augusta, Botetourt, and Fincastle counties. Dunmore would march as well, and he would lead a northern division of men from Frederick County, Shenandoah County, and those in the Fort Pitt area. But despite everything, and one would think if all the Virginians were equally excited to go west and start this war, you would think that Andrew and Charles would drop everything to go to their counties and prepare, but they didn't. On June 10th, Dunmore sent out a letter to all the frontier county lieutenants condemning the House of Burgesses, the Lewis brothers included, for having cared more about acting in response to the events in Boston, to the Boston Port Bill, than in response to the Indian threat along the frontier. We have to remember that these things are happening simultaneously, and the colonists involved cared about both. Meanwhile, Colonels William Christian and William Preston of Fincastle County, which is now the very southeast corner of Virginia, were exchanging private letters discussing how to balance Dunmore's request for war preparations and their lack of authority to order out the militia unless they were actually invaded. They followed orders, they encouraged militia to join the expedition, but those letters they exchanged privately showed a very different opinion. They reflected a populace that were ill prepared to go to war, and in many cases, more interested in finishing their harvests than doing so. Andrew Lewis even wrote privately that he feared he might have to draft men for the expedition because he lacked volunteers. Meanwhile, the war had started without the Southern Division. Connolly had planned to lead about 400 men to attack the upper Shawnee towns, but it kept getting delayed. So finally, in July, he and Dunmore appointed Major Angus MacDonald to lead that expedition. MacDonald was a former Jacobite and a veteran of the Battle of Culloden in Scotland, and his men were all recruited from the area around Fort Pitt, and they were given orders to cause devastation. MacDonald marched them to Wheeling, where they began construction of Fort Fincastle, and then up the Muskingum River to Wakatamike, and the other upper Shawnee towns, including Snakestown. Despite the phrasing when I call them the upper Shawnee towns, these also included towns inhabited by the Mingo. They lived together. Evidence suggests that MacDonald, and indeed Connolly and Dunmore, believed that all the residents, including women and children, were still present. Some historians have suggested otherwise, but I don't believe that is supported by the primary sources. Dunmore had written his instructions explicitly in a letter from June where he says, quote, "I would recommend it to all officers going out on parties to make as many prisoners as they can of women and children. And should you be so fortunate as to reduce those savages to sue for peace, I would not grant it to them on any terms till they were effectually chastised for their insolence, and then on no terms without bringing in 6 of their heads as hostages for their future good behavior." End quote. The women, children, and elderly had in fact vacated that area. This is made clear by a message delivered by White Eyes of the Delaware, though he delivered it too late for MacDonald to get that information. Instead, on August 2nd, MacDonald's expedition encountered a group of about 50 American Indians who had prepared for his arrival. They had made blinds off to the side of the road, and they were waiting to defend their towns against attack. The exact number of men who stood against him is unknown. I have found many very ranging numbers, but I think 50 is a good estimate. And it's likely that these men were both Shawnee and Mingo, though MacDonald's report doesn't specify. To some Virginians, all American Indians were the same, I guess. But regardless of number or identity, I think it's important to note that an armed body of men stood in opposition to MacDonald and engaged in battle with the militia he led. Historians often refer to the Battle of Point Pleasant as the only battle of Dunmore's war. And I'll explain that battle in a minute. But I do believe that this is a very Eurocentric take because it focuses on the battle that meant something to the Virginians. But I guarantee that the attack on these upper Shawnee towns meant something to the people that lived there. After that brief fight, MacDonald left some of his men to guard their wounded and pursued the Shawnee and Mingo warriors through the other nearby towns. In the course of this pursuit, they also encountered Lenape, or Delaware men, though it does not appear that these men were there to oppose them. Instead, they turned over one of the Mingo who had fought MacDonald earlier that day. MacDonald sent him as a messenger, demanding the surrender of white hostages that were being held. That man didn't return. So MacDonald wrote that his next actions were to punish this duplicity. But that would only be the case if he had not already planned to follow Dunmore's orders. At this point, MacDonald and his men encountered a town only to find the scalps of their men, quote, hung up like colors, but the town evacuated, end quote. In response to this, they burned all the homes, 70 acres of cornfields, according to his account, and about 350 bushels of preserved corn. Dunmore proudly reported to Lord Dartmouth that MacDonald's expedition, quote, destroyed their town and totally erased their plantations, end quote. Not long after, on August 7th, Logan and the other 3 warriors in his party arrived at Sinking Creek, just off the New River in southeast Virginia. Several neighboring families had taken refuge in the blockhouse of Balthazar and Catherine Liebrook in response to the reports of an Indian threat. It was a Sunday morning, and the families thought it would be safe for their children to take a break from the blockhouse and go play in the river for a little while. Instead, they made an easy target. Logan's party murdered 7 children, ranging from infancy to 14 years old, and took 3 captive. 2 of those captives were able to escape a couple nights later and report the news of what had happened. Stories of raids like Sinking Creek that were perpetuated by Logan, who was exacting a very personal revenge, nothing to do with the Shawnee, they gave the appearance of validity to the Shawnee threat, making those who considered joining Lewis's Southern Division take things a little more seriously. Sinking Creek was near the home of Colonel William Preston, who requested aid from Pittsylvania County, the neighboring county to the east, and he began to build a fort around his home. In late August, Dunmore traveled to Fort Pitt. This was a chance to make peace. And while there, he met with Alexander McKee and representatives from the Shawnee, Mingo, and Lenape. If peace was what he wanted, he had an odd way of showing it. He did offer gifts to cover the graves of the American Indians who had died, but then he decided to talk about the crimes that he believed the Shawnee had perpetuated. He drew on the background of the French and Indian War and Pontiac's War, claiming that the Shawnee had violated their agreement at the end of those and never really been peaceful in the years since. In speaking of the Shawnee tribe as a whole, this was disingenuous at best. The Shawnee leadership had bent over backwards to maintain peace. They acknowledged that some of their young men might have committed violent acts in isolated situations. And they privately stated that they believed the Mingo were the real troublemakers who had caused anything that did occur. But in answer to the accusation that they had failed to return all captives after Pontiac's War ended, they explained that some of them simply had not wished to return. They didn't deny it to anybody. This just didn't seem to matter to Dunmore. All year, he and Connolly had carefully crafted a narrative and persuaded everyone that the Shawnee were the troublemakers. They weren't about to abandon that now and say that they were wrong. He essentially concluded the talks by telling the Shawnee that he was marching down to Fort Fincastle and they could meet with him along the way. Essentially, this was saying he had every intention of continuing the war. In early September, Colonel Andrew Lewis's Southern Division began to muster at Camp Union, which is now Lewisburg, West Virginia. Most of his approximately 1,300 men were from Augusta, Botetourt, and Fincastle. In smaller numbers, they were joined by companies from Culpeper, Dunmore, and Bedford counties, as well as some from Kentucky. Others stayed behind to man the various forts along the backcountry and protect it from the supposed threat. The plan, as originally decided by Lewis and Dunmore, was that Lewis would march his Southern Division up the Kanawha River, and Dunmore was to march to Fort Pitt, as he had done already, gather the men of the Northern Division, and march down the Ohio River to meet Lewis at what is now Point Pleasant, West Virginia. And there, they were supposed to build a fort for defense of the frontier. From there, they might march into Ohio against the Shawnee, though the Southern Division seemed to be uncertain about what exactly was the plan after building that fort. They seemed to have been left out on a lot of the plans. And I made the point that what I called the Battle of Wakatamike had been overlooked by historians due to their Eurocentric biases. That is not to understate the importance of the better-known Battle of Point Pleasant. After this battle, some Virginians would change their tune about Governor Dunmore, and the Shawnee would change their mind about how to deal with the threat to their people. At the end of August, Dunmore had sent a letter to Lewis suggesting that their meeting place be moved to the mouth of the Little Kanawha River. This is now Parkersburg, West Virginia, roughly. And it was significantly northeast of their original plan. But Lewis, his men were already at Camp Union, and they were ready to march up the Kanawha River. And he replied that it was not in his power to change his route. Few of the white colonists in that part of Virginia had explored what is now West Virginia. But that river was an easy landmark that they could follow. One of Lewis's men, Captain Matthew Arbuckle, had explored it when he was younger, so he was more or less their guide. Lewis did not have guides like Dunmore did. Coming out of Fort Pitt, Dunmore had Indian traders that he could ask to show him the way so that he could know where he was going. Lewis didn't. That's my best guess as to why he said he couldn't change the route. Though anybody who's driven through West Virginia probably also understands there's a lot of mountains in the way. Not everybody wants to march across that. They arrived at Point Pleasant on October 6th. Most of them, anyway. Colonel Christian and about 300 men were lagging behind because they were traveling with the rest of the supplies. But Dunmore wasn't there either. For several days, messengers traveled along the Ohio River between Lewis and Dunmore. Dunmore had decided not to meet them at Point Pleasant, even though he could have, and instead he decided to march directly into Ohio against the Shawnee towns. Building a fort, what he had led Lewis to believe was the primary goal, was apparently no longer a priority. On October 9th, one of Dunmore's messengers was an Indian trader, William McCulloch, who was an acquaintance of one of Lewis's captains, John Stuart. Stuart later wrote in his memoir of the war and included the strange conversation he had had with McCulloch the night before the battle, one that looked differently to him in hindsight. McCulloch said that he had traveled from the Shawnee towns, gone to Dunmore's camp, and then had been sent as a messenger to Lewis. After Stuart asked if he had seen any warriors since leaving Dunmore's army, the trader replied, quote, "Aye, they will be giving you grinders, and that before long," end quote. That's all the man said. Stuart and the men of the Southern Division didn't know how true that was. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Ohio River, a Shawnee chief known to the colonists as Cornstalk was trying one last time to avoid war. He had been one of the leaders who had been working to maintain the peace among his people, and now he was at the head of an army that included Shawnee, Mingo, and their allies, and he made one last offer to his men. He offered to cross the river and discuss peace with this group of Virginians. His men refused, and they crossed the river as an army that night. At some point, Captain White Eyes of the Lenape, or Delaware, warned Dunmore, quote, 700 warriors were gone to the south to speak with the army there, and that they had been followed by another nation, that they would begin with them in the morning, and their business would be over by breakfast time, and then they would speak with his lordship, end quote. The timing of this warning is unclear. There may not have been time to send word to Andrew Lewis to let him know this. A bit before dawn, 2 small hunting parties went out to get some game to go with whatever supplies they had with them. One group, Joseph Huey and James Mooney, traveled northeast along the Ohio River. And what they found was not game, it was Cornstalk's army. This was a couple miles from camp, and both men tried to run back to warn Lewis of what they'd found. One of them did make it back. Huey was killed, but Mooney was able to successfully warn the camp and give them precious moments to wake up, because this is before dawn, and get ready before Cornstalk arrived. Andrew sent his 2 veteran officers, his brother, Colonel Charles Lewis, and Colonel William Fleming, with 300 men total to face the Shawnee. He underestimated how many there were, not that we know an exact number. For the purpose of this talk, I will simply say that after reviewing the primary source documents, Lewis had about 1,000 men. Like I said, Christian was behind with the supplies. He wouldn't arrive until afterwards. And the number in Cornstalk's army is harder to pinpoint. But I usually assume that the intel from White Eyes was probably the most accurate at 700 men. They fought all day, starting a little bit before dawn and stopping after dusk, when Cornstalk led his men in an orderly retreat. The Virginians had 75 dead and 140 wounded. Among the dead was Charles Lewis, the charismatic brother who was loved compared to the stoic Andrew, who was merely respected. After being shot, apparently, Charles made his own way calmly back to camp, stopping to encourage the men as he went along. And one account says that his final words were, quote, "Push on, boys, don't mind me," end quote. It's harder again to count the losses for Cornstalk. Captain William Russell was able to speak with him months later when Cornstalk got permission from the Virginians to return and bury his dead. And Russell reported that in that conversation with Cornstalk, it was revealed that the Shawnee and their allies had lost 100 men, with a great many more wounded. Over the Ohio River, Cornstalk then called a council of his people. He warned that the Virginians were coming, and he believed that they would kill everyone. He presented options that showed how dire he believed the situation to be for his people, eventually convincing his people to accept peace on whatever terms Dunmore offered. Now, I suspect the conversation was way more complicated than that, but that's what we're told. All right. So Dunmore left Fort Gower, where he had been staying, the day after the Battle of Point Pleasant. He had 1,200 men, and he marched straight to the lower Shawnee towns. He sent orders for Andrew Lewis to lead the Southern Division across the river and meet him, though Lewis delayed for nearly a week so that he could take care of his dead and wounded. Dunmore stopped at what is now Pickaway Plains, Ohio, and he named it Camp Charlotte, possibly after the Queen or possibly after his wife. Don't know what kind of man he was. When Lewis marched to join him, there seems to have been some confusion. And again, I'm giving Lewis a little bit of a benefit of the doubt here. But Lewis, again, did not have anyone to lead him. This was an unknown territory to him. He received a message en route that only he and his officers would be allowed to join Dunmore. He continued with his army, presumably expecting to camp them somewhere nearby. But this frightened the Shawnee, understandably, because Lewis had just been in battle with them. And so a few hours later, Dunmore sent another message, ordering Lewis to stop exactly where he was. Now, according to the explanation provided by Lewis's son 60-some years later, this was a bad place to stop. It lacked water. So Lewis went a little bit further until he found water, and then he stopped. Maybe that's what it was. Maybe he was being rebellious. I don't know. But he did stop. And some have portrayed these events to mean that the Southern Division was just bloodthirsty after the Battle of Point Pleasant, and that may be true. But again, they did not have anyone to guide them, so I do not know. After visiting Lewis's camp, Dunmore declared that the Southern Division was a hindrance, and he ordered all of them, including Andrew Lewis and his officers, to return to Point Pleasant. None of them were present for the Camp Charlotte negotiations. That was all between the Shawnee, the Mingo, and Dunmore and his cronies. For all that Dunmore had insisted on portraying the Shawnee as aggressors, as unreasonable, the terms he proposed sound suspiciously like those terms of earlier treaties. As reported by Captain William Crawford of the Northern Division, who was able to be there for those discussions, the terms were these. First, the Shawnee and Mingo would both return all people, black or white, and horses stolen from Virginians since Pontiac's War. Second, no Shawnee or Mingo were to travel south of the Ohio River to hunt, and no white colonists were to go north of the Ohio River, unless they were traders. And again, this is the boundary that had existed since the end of Pontiac's War. To ensure compliance, the Shawnee were to provide 4 chief men as hostages to ensure their good behavior, and these men, we believe, were supposed to be returned to their people when they went back and made a formal treaty later on. Crawford does not specify when these hostages are to be returned, but by the actions of the Virginians later on, that is what they do. Captain Logan did not take part in Camp Charlotte either, but he did send a message. He sent a message in support of peace and consenting to the return of hostages that he had taken during his recent raids along the frontier. But the others of his people did not feel the same. They planned to sneak away, moving further north where they felt beyond the reach of Dunmore, and to take their plunder and hostages with them. As I said, the Shawnee always said that the Mingo were the troublemakers. Dunmore was tipped off to their plan, and so he sent Captain Crawford and 240 men to stop them. And in the raid, Crawford destroyed the town, killed 6, and took 14 people prisoner. In the process, he was able to reclaim some colonists who'd been taken hostage. Dunmore kept most of these prisoner at Fort Pitt. I don't know why he divided the Mingo and the Shawnee, but he did. The 4 Shawnee hostages were taken to Williamsburg. This is where most accounts of Dunmore's war stop. But it isn't really the end of the story, and I want you to know the rest. As for the men who took part in Dunmore's war, the Northern Division would stop off again at Fort Gower on their march home from Camp Charlotte. From a later account written by Daniel Morgan, we are told that when stopping at Fort Gower, the men received an update on the, quote, hostilities being offered to our brethren, the people of Boston, end quote. It was at this time that the officers decided as a military body to state their position publicly. As you heard in the reading earlier, we are told that these officers agreed unanimously on the Fort Gower resolves. We do not know every officer by name. We can guess who was probably there. But they state, not merely as citizens, but also as officers in the militia, their willingness to fight against the crown. And that is what I believe makes the Fort Gower resolves so significant, that they were speaking as officers, not as citizens. The now Lieutenant Colonel Angus MacDonald, apparently he got promoted after he burned corn, he was sent with a copy of these resolves to have them printed in the Virginia Gazette. This was a declaration that they wanted everyone to know about, not something they were keeping amongst themselves. He traveled with the Shawnee hostages as they were taken back to Williamsburg. And we know from the writings of the traveler Nicholas Creswell how impressive these 4 Shawnee hostages were. Tall and masculine, imposing, the son of the principal warrior of the Shawnee, and the rest warriors in their own right, according to that narrative. What Creswell didn't know, or chose not to write, is that they were accompanied by a document offering to challenge the British Empire if they were called to do so by their fellow colonists. The Fort Gower resolves had been signed on November 5th. They were published in the Virginia Gazette on December 22nd. Within a few months, they were reprinted throughout the colonies, and I want you to hear all the places they were able to read these. They were reprinted by the Pennsylvania Journal and the Pennsylvania Gazette, both out of Philadelphia, the New York Journal out of New York City, the Connecticut Journal out of New Haven, Connecticut, the Connecticut Gazette out of New London, the Newport Mercury out of Newport, Rhode Island, the Massachusetts Spy out of Boston, the Essex Gazette out of Salem, Massachusetts, the Essex Journal out of Newburyport, Massachusetts, and the North Carolina Gazette out of New Bern, North Carolina. These are just the ones that I found documented evidence for. It is entirely possible that it was republished further, but suffice to say that the entirety of the 13 colonies was aware of this declaration. From there, the resolves traveled across the ocean. Though Dunmore, for reasons that we can only speculate about, chose not to tell his bosses about the resolves. I wouldn't want to in his shoes either, but his bosses still knew. In Parliament, the Marquis of Rockingham referred to these resolves as truly alarming. Meanwhile, those of the Southern Division, having been sent back to Point Pleasant by Dunmore, went home to their respective counties and wrote resolves of their own. However, those were written as citizens, not as officers. The Fort Gower resolves were unique in their origin and their intent. In addition to the reprints of the Fort Gower resolves, I also want to share part of a letter printed in the Boston Evening Post in February of 1775. The anonymous author drew comparisons between the British Army and the colonial militia, writing that the standing army that was claimed to be there in the colonies for the protection of colonists had offered none. And instead, quote, the noble Virginians were bleeding, dying, and winning the laurels of victory, end quote. That is not to say everything they had done was noble, but the colonists saw them as a body to be reckoned with. To circle back to another issue, the Camp Charlotte Agreement was not fully a treaty in and of itself. It was an interim agreement until they could all meet again at Fort Pitt to finalize matters after the return of hostages and property. That meeting would be delayed significantly due to the start of the American Revolution and Dunmore essentially getting driven out of Virginia by the very colonists he had just fought beside. Connolly would continue conspiring with Dunmore, this time in a way that was actually proven by John Gibson, whose daughter survived the Yellow Creek Massacre. And Connolly would be arrested and imprisoned for his conspiracy. Starting in February of 1775, months before those things began to occur, word started arriving in Virginia that the Shawnee and Mingo were eager to finish things by solidifying the formal peace treaty. They'd heard rumors that the Virginians were going to raise an army and come back and kill them. They wanted things settled. They wanted to know where they stood, even though the colonists were a little distracted at the time. In June, the Virginia House of Burgesses adopted a resolution to move forward with those plans on their own, since Dunmore hadn't. This treaty conference was set for September of 1775, nearly a year after Camp Charlotte. And in the meantime, the British had already begun attempting to convince the tribes to join their side in the upcoming American Revolution. Among those who were able to meet again for this treaty conference were Cornstalk and Andrew Lewis. Luckily, they didn't have to fight this time. Significantly, the representatives of the colonists spoke on behalf of the United Colonies. They did not claim any connection to Great Britain at this time. The peace between each side would not hold. But this was the actual conclusion of Dunmore's war. And though it was his brother Nimoy who had finally given concessions to the United Colonies in the Fort Pitt negotiations, Cornstalk would end up giving his life, quite literally, working to maintain the peace for as long as possible. On the other side, many men, including Daniel Morgan, went on to make a name for themselves during the American Revolution. Also, in time, many colonists became more suspicious of what Dunmore's true intentions had been during Dunmore's War. In one instance, a lieutenant from the Northern Division shared that the governor knew war with Britain was coming, and it was all that had been talked about on the march of the Northern Division. In another, the Virginia Gazette reported claims that Dunmore had marched the Northern Division with, quote, less than a gill of powder a man, end quote, despite having purchased far more under the guise of preparing for this Indian War. This is an obscure measurement that we do not use nowadays, but everyone then was familiar with it because it used to be used to measure liquor rations. But what it is equivalent to, depending on the type of rifle or musket you shoot, is approximately 20 to 25 rounds. And this was an amount that made some people speculate Dunmore had never intended to take part in a battle. He left that to Lewis. With revolution on the horizon, these rumors were plentiful. That doesn't make them true, but it makes them interesting. Lord Dunmore's war truly was Dunmore's war. He and Connolly started it. It was the Shawnee and the Virginians who finished it. But it was also the Shawnee and Virginians who had to deal with the repercussions of it. Not the least of those repercussions was the loss of fathers, brothers, and sons. Thank you.